My topic is international events in the crooked mirror of Joseph Stalin's Gulag, from worker solidarity to the pro-Germany camp revolts. And I will start with saying that numerous features of the Soviet system has been resurrected in present-day Russia, and in particular, a number of practices related to the Soviet penitentiary have become an everyday Russian reality. First of all, propaganda campaigns connected to the rehabilitation and reintegration of the prisoners into society through heroic acts had its counterparts almost 100 years ago. So, yet again, as in the very famous Stalinist campaign of the so called Perekovka, when the prisoners were supposed to be rehabilitated through their glorious labor in the Gulag camps, we can see again how colorful characters with a criminal past were turned into heroes and rewarded from the Russian president and its cadre. And next, I would say that the specific geographical division of labor, characteristic of the modern Russian penitentiary system, and the physical organization of prison camp space go back to the 1930s and the 1940s, as scholars have demonstrated. So I will start saying that the border between the penitentiary and the archipelago and the mainland, in terms of the Russian penitentiary and the Soviet one as well, was not even dotted but transparent, punctuated by the violence and coercion emanated from the Soviet and then the Russian state. The camps and the colonies and the freedom were communicating vessels stimulating an active exchange of cultural stereotypes and social norms. And moreover, as it happened in the Soviet era, the current Russian penitentiary system also promptly reacts to the Russian as well as international affairs. For example, recent occurrences of the prisoner revolts attempts in Russian colonies following Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner march towards Moscow is the most vivid manifestation of it. So the current paper studies the ways the Soviet Gulag prisoners perceived and reacted to the international agenda. And I hope that it will contribute to a better understanding of the current entanglements between the Russian state and its penitentiary practices. So on this picture, you can see how the process of awards of the rehabilitated ex-Wagner warriors occurred in the I think in the beginning of the 1923. Now, of course, it's not possible because Wagner group does not exist any longer. But it's strikingly similar to what happened in the 1930s. Also, and Soviet propagandists in the Gulag camps, following the instructions of the cultural educative section of the Gulag, attempted to integrate the international agenda into their ideological efforts, targeted at the prisoners, armed guards, and the high staff alike. Not only to ensure their loyalty, but to distract them from really deplorable living conditions and working conditions as well. So, as a background, I would say that the regimes of prisoners' isolations were highly different. For example, the giant camps with a population of like more than 100,000 prisoners were characteristic of the Gulag system in the 1930s. And geographically, this network extended into the remote, secluded, or inaccessible regions of the USSR. The post-war period, on the other hand, was marked by unbundling of camp administrations, and the typical camp would now host 20,000, 40,000 prisoners. And smaller camps with a lesser population became widespread in the European part of the USSR. For example, in the late 1940s, the Gulag camp began to penetrate major cities, including Moscow and Leningrad. And to increase secrecy, these camps were assigned abbreviated identifiers. And because of their location, much more effort was put to the isolation of the social and cultural impermeability. So, regarding the contemporary penitentiary system, I would say two striking features are the first one is like the so many colonies located in the remote regions of Russia remain half filled, so there are so many vacant places, obviously reserved for someone. And secondly, the digitalized controls, isolated political prisoners. But this is a really different topic that I don't think I have time to talk about it now. So here we can see these elements of the discursive propaganda campaigns that remind of the 1930s. And going forward, here are my research questions and the sources. So, relying upon the official documents from the NKVD and the archives and documentation, I want to trace parallels between the 1930s, 1950s, and contemporary situation. So, going further, like as I've told you, that the camp press in the Soviet Gulag camps cultivated a heightened interest in world events and foreign cultures. For example, in the 1930s, the readers of the local Gulag enterprises closely followed in the series of articles in the camp newspapers the famous trial of Hayward Patterson that been going in the USA since 1931, the so-called process of the Scottsboro Boys, who were falsely accused of raping two white women while on train in 1931. And this series of articles in the Soviet camp newspapers followed for several years and emphasized racism in the US criminal justice system and claimed that Black people's skin color alone convicted them. What was interesting that, first of all, it generated multiple responses from the readers who wrote letters to the Gulag publishing houses, local publishing houses, with their own feedback on an affair and later published in the newspapers. But it's very debatable whether these letters were not forged by the editors, and I think that they were actually forged by the editors. And another interesting that thing was that the such subjects as Patterson affair in the Gulag camp press rubbed shoulders with local, often petty incidents like fish theft at the camp subsection or a fight between drunken prison guards. And so here are the issues that were like constantly replicated in the camp's press, and I won't dwell on that a lot. So what's really interesting for me is the study courses for the NKVD Soviet political police staff. And I would say here that analyzing the syllabi and the reports from the study groups, I would say that the starting from the 1935 onwards, ideological aspects of training of the newly enrolled NKVD personnel came to the forefront and overshadowed actually the real training. For example, the investigators in the Soviet camps and the NKVD investigators had really limited number of hours, for example, for operative practice or investigating daily crimes, but most of their curriculum was consumed by the struggle with external enemies. For example, one program in training, the White Sea Combined in KVD, extended for 400 hours. This was a 4 months program, and it dwelled upon the special checklist, how they called part of the curriculum. For example, a discipline called Struggle Against the Foreign Services and the Trotsky agents. Leon Trotsky was Stalin oppositioner who fled to abroad and was killed in Mexico later. Focused on German, Polish, Japanese, and other foreign services. And what was striking that all this took place in the context of the camps, where, like, for example, in this camp where where this program was implemented, was like there were no more than like several representatives of each of these nationalities, and these were contained in the barracks and controlled by the armed guards. So I'm still wondering why they was so they used to such a great drill in all this stuff. And then going forward is the uh, foreign influence and prisoners revolts. I think that because they had so much infusion of this international agenda and especially strict like fight with the fascism and stuff. In 1930s, some prisoners' revolts used the idea of an insurgence to overthrow the Soviet regime. For example, in 1937 occurred a revolt in the juvenile colony of the BBK, White Sea Baltic Combined in KVD, was located in northwestern part of the Soviet Union, and was based on exploiting the very famous White Sea Baltic Canal, the so-called Stalin's Canal. And 1937, a revolt in the juvenile colony happened there. And the uniqueness of this mass rebellion, numbering almost 300 delinquents, apart from the fact that it occurred and in 1937 and lasted for some time, like about I think 48 hours. They closed the barracks, they made barricades, and they were like repeating their slogans. It was cast specifically how the investigators repeated later under the Nazi slogans. And in my paper, I analyzed the investigative materials on this revolt and argued that the Soviet propaganda, albeit in a distorted form, always secured a steady and unimpeded flow of information into the Soviet forced labor camps about the international occurrences, and they were uh, distorted in a very peculiar way there. And it never worked the way it was intended, and triggered denial and resistance on the part of many prisoners and of the high staff as well. But regarding the high staff, I would say that it was like a rather a silent everyday dissent. That in the 1930s, they were ignoring the so-called study classes for the politics, for the international politics, and they had a great lack of the instructors, for example. And but the situation changed in the 1941 when the study courses and the propaganda erased all these like previous international occurrences and focused exclusively on the patriotic propaganda. And I would say that when I worked with the documents related to the prisoners' participation in this action, in the military actions on the northwestern Russia in 1941, I was personally struck by the fact that they indeed participated. And I don't know what the composition, what the criminal articles were of these prisoners, but they indeed participated, and that's quite strongly. So, as I think one of the Russian scholars said, that the uniqueness of the Soviet propagandistic culture was that, contrary to all causes, to all circumstances, it gradually worked. Somehow, it really worked. And well, 1940s, 1950s, a different period marked by the inflow of totally different groups of the prisoners, and it was an era of the Gulag revolts, casting the slogans that incorporated multiple aspects of the current international agenda as well. But it was mainly related to the fact that those prisoners belonged to the ethnic. Ethnic groups that were alien to this grand Soviet cultural political modernity project. From the very beginning, these prisoners from the Caucasus denied the ideological efforts, and their military experience in the Second World War gave them much more opportunities for trying to resist this their imprisonment and the Soviet was and so on. And so my preliminary conclusion is that augmented role of the penitentiary in the Soviet and Russian state force mobilization project had its long effects, and the past replicates itself in multiple forms. For example, in the so-called partial mobilization that happened in September 2022 in Russia, This numerical quota principle that functioned at the end of the 1930s during the Stalin's Great Terror again was enforced, that the thought in terms of numbers, in terms of quantity and not quality, because they were under the same great pressure. And as I said, tense informal communications between the penitentiary archipelago and the mainland always distort the mobilization of propagandistic projects. And I would say it's like sometimes it's being on edge, like how much the Russian state is ready to rely on the Soviet practices and to explore the unique possibilities the penitentiary gives it, mainly the human resources in the unlimited form. So at the beginning of the 1930s, one of Stalin's associates, Vyacheslav Motov, prepared a report for them on on the preparedness of Soviet Union for the mobilizational industrial projects. And this report included several graphs like human resources, technical capabilities, infrastructural capabilities. And in all graphs of these reports, it was like almost nothing, because the Soviet Union was lacking everything apart from the and only the graph which stated human resources was marked by Motov as unlimited. So this is, I think, is like important in the current context as well. And finally, the polarization of the penitentiary structures is also an important feature, because this is related to the political prisoners, which are in completely different state than they were in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. And this is again the question of how the Russian state is being exploiting this aspect, and how the unintended consequences, like of history, make it play out in the ground completely different. And I would say that increasing effect on Russian society in rhetoric and protest patterns. I also discussed this in my paper, but it's still, these are the remote consequences which we still will be able to see in the nearest and the remote future. Thank you very much.